The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Ross Thomas. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is Ross Thomas, who is the author of 24 novels, and the latest of these is Voodoo Limited. Welcome,
Thank
Ross.
you.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Ross Thomas has been called the Master of Suspense and has been honored with several Edgar Awards, and he has an interesting background of his own that shows up in his international espionage books. Tell us, Ross, a little bit more about where you've been and some of your real-life adventures.
Well, so the real-life adventures have taken me from Denver, Colorado, where when I was very young, 30 in 1956, I ran a couple of campaigns, one for the governor and one for the senator, who are aspiring candidates, I should say. The senator was a notorious tightwad and didn't spend the $2,000 I recommended he spend. He lost. Then the governor spent the $2,000 or $3,000. He won. And from there, I went to became a foreign correspondent in Bonn, Germany, and I was there for a couple of years. And a certain Mr. Patrick Dolan and Associates in London, England, called me over and asked me to go down to Nigeria to, as he put it, inject a little American razzmatazz into the first election after independence in Nigeria. Our candidate was Chief Obafemi Awolowo. Our principal opponent was Alhaji Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Chief Awolowo was a devout Christian. Alhaji Sir Abubakar was a devout Muslim. There were many more Muslims than there were Christians. Our candidate lost by a landslide, but we did bring in some American razzmatazz. We brought in skywriting. We brought the skywriting to Africa for the first time. And after the election, my candidate, Chief Awolowo, was sentenced to jail for 2 years for high treason. And a couple of years later, Alhaji Sir Abubakar was shot dead by an army coup. And my candidate eventually became much revered candidate, and not only in Nigeria, but also in all of Africa, wound up as Minister of Finance and probably very rich. And that was some of the scenes that I've used, or some of the experience I've used in my books. It's mostly politics and organizations. I was with the two very large labor organizations at one time, and I've used that in a couple of the books.
I would assume some of those tightwads and rich men also showed up in your novels.
Oh yes, the politicians show up in the novels. I've known many of them, loved them all. I find them very amusing company.
And it shows, it certainly shows in your characterizations. You're famous for international espionage. Has the end of the Cold War moved you more into the domestic, I guess what I'm calling domestic type espionage that shows up, for instance, in Voodoo Limited?
No, I don't think so. The Cold War is over, but the espionage of one kind or another of a high-tech level is still going on, but it's industrial espionage and it's international. And so if you wanted to write espionage tales, you could write about industrial espionage, not for the hearts and minds of men, but for billions and billions of dollars would be the profit motive would enter into it rather than the patriotic motive. And that can be done. I think is probably being done right now, but I haven't touched it so far. I don't quite know what I'm going to do, but I like that notion that I don't quite know what I'm going to do.
So the Cold War hasn't put you out of material?
Not in the least. Not in the least.
And you do like not knowing what will be next for you?
It's the way I write my books, not knowing what's going to happen next. And
so it's a surprise for you as well as the reader?
Entertainment for me, as I hope it is entertainment for the reader if I don't entertain myself.
It certainly is, and surprise is, now that I think of it, kind of a theme throughout your novels.
Yes.
in the reader's mind, he may say, I know now how it's going to work out, and it seldom does, right?
That's true.
So is that kind of part of your surprise too?
Yes, it's part of the craft, I suppose. And it's part and parcel of how I keep myself going writing, because I am entertaining myself.
Well, and it really is a craft, I think, to write, because suspense books aren't the only books that every book needs a certain amount of suspense to keep the reader going.
Oh, yes, every book has suspense,
And,
to one level or another.
Tell us a little about your philosophy of suspense, or how you keep books going.
Well, you end a chapter with a question mark, not a literal question mark, but something is about to happen. Something might happen. Something should happen. The next chapter answers that figurative question, but it is a surprise answer. And that way I think you keep the suspense going. That is a very crude explanation of how it works, but it's the way I write. And I like to write chapters that are almost self-contained, but still lead to the next chapter, and which produce a surprise in the opening pages of the next chapter, which is probably the puzzle in the last chapter.
And your chapters are relatively short, so it's the sort of thing where even though the roast is burning in the oven, you're very tempted to stay on for just one more.
I hope so.
More chapter. You're known for your trendy dialogue and your good characterizations. And in addition, I have to say, your suspense novels are one of the few novels that I always find myself smiling at as I read. Oh,
humor is a very important part of writing, I think. It's not for chuckles, or it's maybe for the chuckle instead of the hearty laugh, but I think the humor comes from the reader's identification with some of the foibles of the characters, or or identification with the characters, and how they go directly about doing something that they shouldn't do, but because the reader knows them by now, he expects them to do that. He or she expects the character to do that. And some readers have favorite characters, and they want me to bring them back. I sometimes get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you can hear the ice tinkling in the glass, and the voice saying, "When are you going to bring back McCorkle and Pagillo again?" And those were two of the characters in my earlier books. And finally, I wrote them back last year in Twilight at Mac's Place, last year being 1991. And I haven't had any of those calls since.
And indeed, Voodoo Limited brings back a cast of characters for Out on the Rim and Chinaman's Chance.
It brings back Arthur Case Wu, or Artie Wu, who has the most tenuous connection or claim to the Emperor's throne of China. It brings back his lifelong partner, Quincy Durant. It brings back, they both grew up in a orphanage, Methodist orphanage in San Francisco, from which they ran away at 14. It brings back Maurice, other guy, Overby. The nickname is because whatever predicament he finds himself in, he always swears that it was some other guy who did it. And also Georgia Blue, an ex-Secret Service agent who has turned adventurer. And some others that will be familiar to the reader of the earlier books. And they're off on a quest for a couple of missing hypnotists. And the hypnotists have hypnotized a movie star who is accused of killing her billionaire boyfriend, and now the hypnotists have disappeared. And the person who hired them, the supplier of these particular hypnotists, was a German industrialist, or I should say entrepreneur, who pretended he could not pronounce the name of the firm, which was Voodoo, for Wu and Durant, Limited, and he kept calling it Voodoo Limited. And so I thought it was a natural title for the book.
It was a perfect title.
Thank you.
Perfect. One of the things I think that people say about your books is that part of the suspense that's created is because one cares about the characters. one even cares about the not so nice characters in your books, probably because they are characters.
Well, I try to make them as real as possible, and you do this by endowing them with pleasant traits as well as unpleasant traits. They may be charming, they may be witty, and they may be evil as sin, but you find that their charm and their wit and their winsomeness even somehow win you over. And I like to paint villains or create villains who are not all villainous, who have some redeeming qualities, but not enough to redeem them altogether.
They're very distinct, and I think the characters stay in your mind. For instance, no one would ever mix up Artie Wu with Quincy Durant.
No, no one would. At least I hope that.
Your novels are very different from formula mysteries, and they're also very different from each other. How do you avoid getting stuck in a particular, I shouldn't say style of writing because you have your style of writing, but how do you keep them from being a formula?
Well, I keep them from being in a formula, I hope, by starting, as I've always started a novel, with characters. Either, in this case, I started with familiar characters, but with unfamiliar characters with whom I research in my mind quite carefully. I build them up until I think I know them. And then I write an opening paragraph. I could give you an example if you would like.
Please.
I used to live in a beach house in Malibu, and I lived there with that reduced rent because the landlady said that the movie companies occasionally would like to use it. And I found out that every time some screenwriter in Hollywood would write exterior sleazy beach house day, he would have mine in mind. So quite a few of them came. But I was sitting out there and I saw a man with 3 greyhounds. And he'd walk up at the beach toward my house, and he'd turn around and go back. And I kept wondering who the man with 3 greyhounds was. And so I decided that I knew who he was. I gave him a character, and then I thought, well, what would happen if somebody were to trip over a dead pelican and meet this man? And who would trip over a dead pelican? And I said, a Chinese gentleman, a fat Chinaman. And sure enough, the fat Chinaman, Artie Wu, tripped over the pelican, met the man with 6 greyhounds, as I doubled the number, and he went into the small beach house, and there he discovered Quincy Durant. And I didn't know Quincy Durant was going to be there, but he had to find somebody, and that's how it started. And all that took the space of about, I'd say, 3 pages. And by now I knew my characters. I knew one of the principal protagonists, and I hadn't the vaguest idea what was going to happen next, but I was mighty interested.
And you kept on writing?
Kept on writing, yes.
How long, just as an aside here, how long did it take you to finish
I think in that book it took probably 6 or 7 months, and on the books I write now it takes about a year because I grow progressively more particular and I rewrite more and polish more, and most of what I write winds up in the wastebasket, and it just takes, I think it's particular, but I'm being more particular. That's all I can think of.
How do you keep track of your characters? Do you keep family trees or histories?
No, I give them unusual names. I have a terrible memory for names. And so if I call a man Homer Necessary, a Sergeant Homer Necessary, I can remember him easily enough. Or if I call somebody Lucifer Die, he's not too hard to remember. Or Chub Dungy, he's easy to remember. And this is why people say I give my characters fantastic names, but they don't know about my failing memory or my inability to remember names.
So when you call them up again, you don't have pages and pages of writing of them.
No, I just know.
I think that's a wonderful memory.
Yeah, I just remember them. I've spent a lot of time with them, so I remember them well.
And learn to love them too.
To love and to hate.
Do you resent the label escape reading that is often given to suspense?
No, I think escape reading is great. I mean, you can, if you want to, I think it's better than turning on the television set or perhaps going to certain rock concerts. it's better than whiskey, I suppose. Other escapes or
Well,
drugs.
some might argue with that, but I think that when I go home from a stressful day, it's just wonderful to pick up a book of suspense and read about somebody else's stress rather
Well,
than
you can
mine.
lose yourself in it for a little while and be entertained at the same time, and it has no deleterious effect upon you, except perhaps your eyes. That's
Critics have called your books political thrillers, international espionage, capers. How would you like to see them described?
I would think I could lump them all into one simpler classification. I think they're crime fiction, because some crime has always been committed, and that's a very generic term, or it's a quite generic term that would encompass all of them, I believe. So, but I won't argue about any of those classifications.
They're that and
That and more.
and more.
Yes.
Okay. Publishers Weekly says you're the best there is. How did you get so good?
Well, I lived a clean life and studied hard. And all
Really?
this. Well, I have no idea. That's this week. That was that week's Publisher Weekly, and next week they will have another The Best There Is. So, but I was pleased with it. I like praise, like everybody else, and I ignore the knocks sometimes.
You have a fascinating stable of characters, and we've already talked about the fact that you do reuse them. How does that work, since you're really not writing a series book in the sense that a detective that follows the same series through? And so it's not that, for instance, Chinaman's Chance and Out on the Rim and Voodoo Limited all came out as a series. There were other books in between.
Well, I write them one as separate books. They can be read from front to back, or from beginning to end, or start in the middle if you want to. And you'll still get a novel. Each one is a distinct novel, and and the characters are introduced each time. You will note that they grow progressively older. Their children grow older. They can't stay 36 forever. They got to be 42 or 45, somewhere around there. And the same thing happened with McCorkle and Padillo, and the characters that I started out with in the Cold War Swap. They were 38 when they first began, and they are, I think, pushing 65 in the last book, which came out in 1991. And but there are younger characters, and I brought in, for instance, McCorkle's daughter, and also her new boyfriend, former police sergeant, homicide sergeant from Los Angeles, who studied at the University of Virginia and took his degree in Old French. I think he studied Peinture Gouache, and never mind what he studied, but it was Old French. Probably the only LAPD detective with a degree in Old French.
Well, it's such a pleasure to find these characters showing up again, especially when you didn't expect it. As it happened, I read Out on the Rim after I read Voodoo Limited, and it was fun to go back too and see them from an earlier time. You do, though, write a series under the pseudonym of Oliver Bleak.
Yes, I did write a series of 5 books under Oliver Bleak. Oliver Bleak was an ex-newspaper columnist who turned professional go-between. And he was witty, insouciant, debonair, and they made a movie out of it called St. Ives. His name was Philip St. Ives. And the movie starred Charles Bronson, who was playing a debonair, insouciant, sophisticated New York man about town. I got the name Oliver Bleak because I was going to a funeral in Alabama, and I was in the Tutwiler Hotel, I remember. And my editor called up and said he needed a pseudonym. I looked out the window, it was Bleak. I said, it's going to be, call it Bleak, but spell it B-L-E-E-C-K. He said, that's pronounced Blake, old boy, and hung up, and that's how the pseudonym came about.
You seem to like go-between characters.
Yes.
Essentially, the characters in Voodoo Limited are go-between.
Yes, yes, they are.
Highly paid go-between.
Highly paid go-betweens, yes.
Characters. Why is that?
I like, in the public relations work I did, I had to deal with some, and especially in later years, I had to deal with some rather seamy characters who I didn't trust for a second, but whom I liked enormously. And I grew fond of them and kept my hand in my hip pocket in my wallet, and but I did like them, and I like to write about people like that, because I think they're interesting. I think they're fascinating. I think their somewhat skewed view of morality is not something to be emulated, but something to be appreciated. I find it terribly amusing.
Another theme that seems to come about in your fiction is political corruption and or human corruption. What is it about this human frailty that attracts you?
Political corruption, I suppose, speaks for itself, because I was involved in politics for so long, and I saw so much of it at first hand. And human corruption, I think, is the failing of all of us to a certain extent, or the weakness in all of us to a certain extent. Some of us more than others, and I like to write about the ones who have more than we do. So I do.
And they're so successful.
Yes, they are. They are. They sometimes win.
Crime does usually pay in your novels.
With my characters, it often pays, and sometimes it doesn't. Though I try to keep away from the hard and fast rules and the old cliches, and sometimes the good guys really don't win.
There's a certain satisfaction, I think, in your books, and they don't always clearly win, but they've had an awfully good time trying.
That's right, and I hope the reader has too.
Critics say that you deserve a greater audience than you have. Do you write for a particular audience?
No, I write for myself. That's the only audience I'm thinking about when I'm writing. If it amuses me or entertains me, then I assume it'll entertain a wider audience. I don't know what I'd have to do to achieve a wider audience. Well, perhaps more advertising by my publisher, or
We spend that $2,000.
yeah, I could give them some advice in public relations. But no, it's been building over the years, and I think the audience is building. I've become enormously popular in Germany, for example, and also in France. But that may be because I have a wonderful translator in France, and he's translated the last 3 books, so the translation might have helped.
Well, I can tell you that in our library system, there are always reserves waiting for your books. So.
That is good news. It would be even better if they went out and bought it. They didn't want to wait.
Well, we have a number of bookstores right around here, so I'm sure they're doing that, especially when the reserve lists are so long as to be discouraging. Briarpatch won an Edgar in the 80s and the Cold War Swap in 1966. So you've had not only a long career of writing, but a long career of excellent writing. It sounds like you have fun at it, though, too. It sounds like you're not the sort of disciplined, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning kind of writer.
No, I get up around 8, and I start at 9, and I write on my new typewriter, which is a 1969 Adler. There's only one man in Los Angeles who knows how to repair it, and he's threatening to go back to Buenos Aires. So when he goes, I don't know what I'll do. And I quit it too, and I work 6 days a week. And it's just, I don't want to call it, I don't want to dignify what I do by calling it disciplined, but I sit there until either I have 4 or 5 pages, or until I have 1 page, but it's 5 or 6 hours a day.
Did you get away for long vacations after a book is over?
Oh yes, I travel a lot. Yes, that's one of
Back to some of your old haunts?
Back to some of my old haunts. My favorite vacation is to rent a car in Paris and without any reservations just start off. So we did that for Berlin just before the 2 Germanys rejoined, and it was interesting crossing the border and seeing all the vacant watchtowers and parking spaces and what have you. But we just drive and stop wherever we please. And Sometimes it's an expensive place, and sometimes it's a very cheap place. It's just whatever's available.
The YMCA's of
We have not
Durham.
stopped at the YMCA's yet, but we'll take a note from we'll take take a note from other guy and keep the membership up just in case.
Editors often say that any bit of writing that does not move the plot forward should be eliminated. But I've noticed that you use, for instance, in Briar Patch, you have some wonderful asides about the history of some of the buildings that seems to add a lot of interest. For instance, in reading that book, I thought it almost said to me that this community had an interesting, close community history before modern day
Yes,
progress moved in.
I think you should give the background of where you are. You can say this is New York, or you can say, in this case, I left the city unnamed, and I got a letter from the New Yorker, called it Denver, swore it was Denver. There was a lady in Wichita Falls who said, "You certainly know Wichita Falls." Actually, it was Oklahoma City, where I was born.
Uh-huh.
And I picked up the Denver Press Club and plopped it down in the middle of Oklahoma City, which would never deign to have a press club, my God, no. And I had that, and so from there I went, and I created a city and used the disguising all the names and just never naming the city. And I thought that gave it an extra fillip of suspense if the name would ever be revealed, and it never was. But in telling about the city, I like to give history of places that exist, because it seems to give another dimension. It gives a sense of reality to the place, and it grants it an existence. And I think that's important in a story. Whether it advances the plot, I think it advances the plot myself, because you have space, time, and space is the place where you are.
It also maybe lends a sense of uniqueness.
It does, uniqueness, and there's some matter of, yes, I think uniqueness is what it is. This is a unique place, and you should know about it.
I have to ask you, was Georgia Blue a person you knew when you were in the Philippines?
No, Georgia Blue was not a person I knew. When I was in the Philippines, Georgia Blue reminded me of a certain woman labor organizer I knew at one time, and she was as competent as any of the males, if not more so.
Do any of the people recognize themselves in your books?
A lot of people hope they do.
Oh, they do.
Yes.
Ross, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much, and I certainly invite the audience to read Voodoo Limited wherever you can find it. It's a good read. You'll enjoy it.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.